Hi, I'd like to welcome you to episode 116 of the Crucible of Thought podcast. I'm Brandon, and I'm here to share things that interest me and things that I think the Lord has brought to my attention. Today I had a chance to interview Rick Pidcock, who I've followed for some time on various social media platforms, and in particular his writing with Baptist News Global was what caught my attention. He's a very diverse thinker, covering a lot of different topics that are directly relevant to the church today, and I really wanted to get to know him a little bit and find out what makes him tick and how his outlook has been formed. We covered a lot of different topics in this discussion, including his music under the Provoke Wonder name, and a book that he's writing on the topic of warfare and worship in the evangelical church, his writing for social media and for Baptist News Global, and a few rabbit trails into theology and politics. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I think you will too. Well, hi, Rick. It's good to talk to you finally. We've been back and forth a little bit on Facebook and on Twitter. I've seen plenty of your content, and finally, really happy to get a chance to talk to you and kind of figure out what makes you tick.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me.
I'd love it if you could give your real quick introduction to yourself and where you come from, and you know what makes you you.
Yeah, definitely. So my quick, story would be I grew up in a fundamentalist independent Baptist home, and parents went to Bob Jones University,
Huh.
and then ended up when I went to Bob Jones University as well for college, and then got a degree in Bible there. Went on to be involved with church planting out in Colorado, and was in conservative evangelical churches for the next 15 years, and then ended up going through a worship school that really led to a lot of internal and spiritual healing for me, which then ended up leading to a lot of theological reflection. And eventually and during that time I had been in the cleaning industry as well, because church planting doesn't really pay. And so that's what I was doing to make the bills. And then once my theology changed and I wasn't going to be leading worship anymore, I was basically had no career. And at that point, people weren't taking my resume seriously. Ended up going to seminary. I really wanted to write, and and then in 2019 I became a stay-at-home dad, and I've been in December of 2019, and so that's what I've been doing for almost the past 5 years. So
How old are your kids?
everywhere from 6 to 14 every other year.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. And I saw you're writing a book, Worship Warfare. I want to talk about that a little later, but it's interesting that you come from the worship leading background. I led worship for about 15 years. I was on worship teams from the time I was 14, so 40
Oh,
years of
okay.
that. But I led worship, and I actually still do occasionally about a once a month at a local homeless shelter. So
Oh, okay,
um,
cool.
come from a similar background in that sense. So
Yeah.
okay, well that's really cool. Um, unlike a lot of my interviews, you don't really seem to have a real laser focus on a particular topic. So you have a very generalist approach in your writings and your online presence. So I'm going to bounce around a little bit on my comments and my questions to you.
Yeah,
Uh,
definitely.
what are, what are some of your core theological commitments these days? Obviously, you've deconstructed quite a bit. What still makes you tick?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting because basically, like, there's so much opportunity out there to discover different people's perspectives on things, and and I think even when you look at the Bible itself, there are so many different perspectives even in the Bible, especially when it comes to how, like, Israel is in relationship to exile. And even when I was a conservative evangelical or a fundamentalist, we had this category called progressive revelation, where God revealed more and more throughout the story of the Bible over
Hmm.
time. And so it's interesting because we often talk about what doesn't change in Christian circles, but they're really inherent even to the Bible itself is this change over time, and is a
Right.
diversity of perspectives. And so basically where I've come to is, like, I want to acknowledge the the evolution, so to speak, the changing, the perspectives. I want to acknowledge that, in a sense, we're looking through a dark mirror at a lot of
Hmm.
these concepts, but also within that world of change and perspectives, there are some consistencies. And if you look at like Leviticus 19, it talks about loving at the center of the law. It's talking about loving God and loving your neighbors yourself. And
Hmm.
if you look at the teaching of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, it's the center of his teaching as well. And Jesus is even acknowledging a lot of this. You've heard this said, but I'm telling you this. You've heard it said, but I'm telling you this. And a lot of those things that he's saying, you've heard it said, those were things in the Hebrew Bible that were,
Right.
those things were said. And so I think that whatever changes I have experienced over the last 5 years or so, I appreciate that consistency in scripture between the the Hebrew Bible and the teaching of Jesus of the centrality of loving your neighbors yourself. And I think that that consistency is really where I hang my hat on a lot um, these days, and I think that has implications for other theology.
Does. Yeah.
So, I'm going to be very committed to restorative justice because if you really love your neighbor as yourself, you're not going to be seeking
Right.
retribution against them. And I'm going to do a lot of work on reflecting on the relationship between the root and the fruit. What
Okay.
kind of tree is this? If we're seeing a lot of bad fruit, what's being planted, and what structures and branches might be forming to produce this particular fruit that we're seeing today?
You sound very similar to my thoughts on these things. I wrote a blog piece a couple years ago called, or about a year ago, called Trajectory. The idea of this progressive revelation. But the interesting thing about the trajectory is it doesn't go up and then flatline.
Hmm.
A trajectory you would assume is going to continue. And so the idea that, okay, we got to the end of Revelation or whatever the last book actually was written, and that was the end of all the revelation is kind of ludicrous. And it makes much more sense to believe that Jesus was pointing us towards something that would continue.
Yeah,
And
and
we ought to expect that increased constant flow of God's spirit into the world.
yeah, it's interesting too because like a lot of fundamentalists, they'll say stick to the text.
Hmm.
And like on one hand, I can understand what they're saying, but if you actually examine the text, beyond just the general progressive revelation that they themselves would admit is there, like Jesus says, he said that there are things I have to tell you that you're not ready to hear yet.
Right.
And he said, you're going to go on and do greater things than I did.
Hmm.
So even if you look at the text itself, Jesus is telling us there are places to go, things to learn, things to do beyond what is going to be recorded here that you're not ready for yet. And I would think 2,000 years later, maybe we're ready for some of those things.
And I mean, he was pretty explicit about sending the Holy Spirit to do exactly that, right?
Yeah.
We were primed for that. I guess the hard part is expecting that Jesus could say, "You heard it said, but I tell you," and not expect that today. You know,
Hmm.
even things that maybe Paul said just might have missed the mark,
Yeah.
which rattle the cage of any good conservative. So you've clearly deconstructed quite a bit. You inherited the Bob Jones theology, and I'm basically familiar with a lot of that. I kind of grew up in not quite so fundamentalist evangelicalism, but strongly evangelical, and I had some extended family that were deep into the heavy duty Baptist fundamentalist viewpoint. King James only, and we were going to hell because my church spoke in tongues and that kind of stuff. So yeah, I know where that comes from. How do you feel about the terminology of deconstruction? Is there a good or bad to that, or is there a better way to talk about it?
I'm kind of strange on this because I know a lot of people don't like it, but I actually like it because to me, like deconstruction, I kind of picture in my imagination a tower, like the Tower of Babel. And I often talk about so conservative evangelicalism is based on these hierarchical relationships of authority and submission. And so
Hmm.
I kind of see the men in charge as like they're in the top room of the tower, and so there, and then everyone is below them in these vertical relationships of authority and
Right.
submission. And so to me, deconstruction is basically saying, let's take down the walls of this tower in order to open ourselves up to this beautiful relational reality that we have.
Hmm.
And so I see deconstruction as kind of an opening up. It, to me, it doesn't feel like tearing down and being negative. I think people associate that with being negative about Christianity, but to me, it's it's an opening up of, from these power structures and the darkness that it causes and the dehumanization that it causes, to so that you can actually go out and into the forest and the fields and see the oceans and actually enjoy being with your neighbors without these walls between you.
I understand a lot of that pushback against deconstruction actually comes from assuming that it has to do with a particular maybe theological or philosophical word that doesn't really apply to what most people today mean it to
Yeah.
say. So I tend, if I'm talking to audiences outside my circle, I'll kind of put a D/reconstruction just to make it clear that I'm
Hmm.
not deconstructing and walking away. But
Yeah,
I
and
think
I
that's
think
really
I think
a concern a lot of people have.
yeah, my concern with the reconstruction term, and I know a lot of people use that, is like, I don't want to build another tower with walls between me and my neighbors, because for
Yeah.
me it goes back to what drives me, is this love of neighbor as self. So then how is there a wall between me and my neighbor? And so it's not that I want to just be negative all the time and then not have any alternative. It's that I don't, like, I want to love my neighbor as myself. There's a
Yeah.
organic nature to it. So it's for me, I'm moving toward a different metaphor, if that makes sense.
It does. I never thought about deconstruction as taking a building down in that sense. I, I I kind of think of it like taking my foundation apart and
Hmm.
figuring out what's underlying the systems that I think about and that I assume are correct. And once you start digging at those foundational bricks, entire walls of buildings sometimes fall down because they're not supported anymore. And you have to put a different foundation in place. So I think about it from that context, I guess.
Hmm.
Um, what's your current sense of soteriology, the doctrine of salvation? I mean, I would assume from what you're saying already that eternal conscious torment is not on your radar. Um, how about annihilationism or universal reconciliation or universal salvation? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think a big thing for me is getting down to the basics of what is good news. The gospel is good news. And so for me, something needs to, for me to consider something worth celebrating, it needs to actually be good news. And so I think Bradley Jerzak has a book, I believe
Mhm.
it's called Her Gates Will Never Be Shut, where he
Great
he
book.
shows how, yeah, so he shows how, like, all three of these positions, eternal conscious torment, annihilationism, and universal redemption, can all three be taken from Scripture.
Yes.
A lot of people in the eternal conscious torment thing think, well, if you reject ECT, then you're walking away from Scripture. But there are cases to be made
Yeah.
for all three, and so for me, I'm going to run it through the prism of what is good news. And if eternal conscious torment is true, then I need to either be able to celebrate that as good and just, or I need to no longer be aware that my neighbors exist
Hmm.
and in heaven. And to me, neither of those are good news.
Yeah.
In annihilationism, like I can see that maybe as better news. So maybe there's a degrees of good news, because then you're not, like, literally burning with worms going through your skin for eternity. But to me, it's like, is it good enough? And for me personally, it's not good enough. And so that's why, for me, the only one that feels good enough to me is a universal redemption that doesn't overlook the exiles that we've caused and the harm that we've caused, but that actually heals every one of those exiles and harms that we've caused. And again, some of this is speculation. We're looking through a dark mirror. I don't know what happens after we die. Um, I can't be certain about it. But I can recognize the fact that one of these seems like more good news to me than the others, and that's what I can hope for.
Going back to your previous point about the fruit, and I certainly think that we agree on that, and that the idea of universal reconciliation much more closely follows what the Bible presents about the nature and character of God as a whole, especially on the trajectory near the end of the
Hmm.
trajectory of the Bible when people started to see the world through Jesus lens. And so I reject ECT for that reason. But I think even more than that, when you look at the fruit, there's a lot of really bad fruit of ECT. And I think that is what pushes me over the line away from annihilationism, even is to when you start thinking about God as being truly desirous of redeeming every single human, that changes how we interact with every single human and doesn't leave us a whole lot of room to say, well, they're going to disappear anyway.
Yeah.
So,
And Jesus didn't, like, on the cross, he didn't say, uh, Father, cause them to not exist anymore, for they know not what they do. He said, forgive them, for they know not what they do.
yeah.
And I think we need to recognize our humanity, that we really have no idea the the depths of things within us that are influencing us and the decisions we make. I think a lot of, like, neuroscience and things like that help us today to learn how our brains work, and we can learn how, even in our bodies, we hold trauma from previous
Mhm.
generations, and I think that rings true to me, that we really don't know what we're doing, and I kind of see a lot of the salvation conversation as this deepening of awareness of what are we doing, and then meeting that with the good news of healing.
Yeah. With all these things in mind, what's your greatest concern right now for the church with a capital C?
I think the biggest concern I have right now, to boil it down, would be a lack of self-awareness.
Hmm.
I think there's just we don't know ourselves, and we don't know how the root of the seeds that we're planting theologically are leading to the fruit that's manifesting itself. And it's like, it's so hard to get people to reflect on how their theology and the things that they celebrate is shaping their values and the way they walk in the world.
You think we can do anything positive about those things? I mean, are those of us that are kind of outside the fringe of orthodoxy these days, can we be heard enough to actually make a difference as we kind of present a different gospel than has been heard for the last, at least the last few hundred years?
Yeah, I think creative people can make things. Some of us can bring awareness to these connections, um, and then also we can make things like there's a song. One of the top songs in evangelical churches right now says, "Praise is the water my enemies drown in."
Hmm.
Well, okay, so we're in this Christian nationalist society where we're talking about Democrats as being demons, and or controlled by demons, and they're the enemy, and you're singing in church on Sunday morning that praise is the water they're drowning in, and you're like celebrating, like, this is great. Like, what is that doing to your humanity? But
Yeah.
also, like, there's no reason that song should be the language of our churches. You could write other songs that actually, celebrate love of neighbor and self. And so I think we can put out more liturgies and more songs as a way of reshaping that language.
Uh, Seems like a good time to talk about your music because I know Provoke Wonder, you've got that rolling, and you've got some intriguing lyrical themes that kind of go to what you're talking about there. It's certainly not classic, if I could use that word, conservative uh, liturgical stuff that fits into the the Bethel and the those current standards. So you've obviously pushed in a different direction with that. How did obviously as a worship leader then I guess is where that all started. But uh, tell me more about your Provoke Wonder world.
Yeah, so I led worship for 15 years in these churches, and then I went through the worship school that my church had set up for us, and that ended up leading to the theological deconstruction. But then it was like I'm still a musician, and like my last year at our church, I stopped. I didn't lead worship for the final year at my conservative evangelical church, and basically just sitting in the seats there, like towards the end, I could only sing maybe 40% of the songs,
Hmm.
and now it would even be less than that. And so, but I didn't stop being a musician. And so I wanted to, this is about 2018, I wanted to explore my songwriting. Um, and I wasn't quite sure how to do that. And I wasn't even quite sure what I believed. And so I watched this YouTube video of Rob Bell talking about the story of is everything is spiritual. He actually has two of them out. And he was basically like looking at the universe and how the universe evolves over 14 billion years, and seeing how like um stars cultivate within themselves the necessary elements to create life, but the stars have to die in order for what was cultivated in their center to spread through the universe. And talking about how um, things grow by seeds being planted and growing over time. And all of a sudden, I'm seeing this language of us like a centeredness, a drawing together with other bodies, and a growing, becoming over time that to me feels very spiritual and very, very poetic. There's a lot there that could be explored. And it was also, it felt very consistent with some of what I was seeing in the Bible of how, like, um, there's these metaphors in the Bible. A lot of Jesus's metaphors were about seeds being planted, or
Hmm.
God's word is going to accomplish that which it. Uh, I It's been a while since I've looked at this, so I'm quoting off the top of my head, but basically, like, God's word is going to accomplish that which it um, intended to. Well,
Right.
the metaphor it uses is of a seed being planted,
Yeah.
and that doesn't just instantly pop things into being; it grows over time. And so, what I wanted to do with the Provoke Wonder music was to begin to explore some of those metaphors that engage some of the themes I was seeing as good news throughout Scripture, with also the things that we can observe about the universe. And so I've got some different songs on that first album about that called "Consider the Stars." Um, yeah, and like David in the Psalms, he said, "When I consider the heavens, what is man that you're mindful of him?"
Yeah.
Like, to me, we know a lot more about the stars now than they knew 2 to 3 thousand years ago. So if the biblical author is saying, "When I consider the stars, what is my identity as a human?" Well, why can't we consider the stars with so much more knowledge we have today and telescopes and all that, and consider our human identity as well?
Hmm.
And so I was trying to put some of that in music.
What's your hope for the label or the music that you have? I mean, I think I wrote a number of songs, and we used a fair number. I used as a worship leader a fair number of them in our worship services, but I don't expect anybody else to ever adopt those into their system. And honestly, some of the later stuff I wrote, when I look back on it, I was already processing things that I wasn't even aware of, and they're not going to fit into a standard Sunday morning thing. So it almost feels like they were for me, but I don't know.
Hmm.
What's your experience?
Yeah, my music has not really done much as far as like a lot of people seeing it. I was able to present it at the BioLogos National Conference in
Oh,
2019, and and that was really fun. Excuse me. But it doesn't get a lot of listens on Apple Music or anything. So I think it's a way for some people who are coming out of Christianity or are processing things who still feel a spiritual ache in them for
Hmm.
significance and for community and for just a way of talking about reality and wholeness. I think it can give some of those people some musical outlets to explore, but I'm not like under a I don't think that next week I'm going to discover that they had 100,000 plays.
Yeah. How many instruments do you play? Do you do all the recording yourself, or is it like a lot of electronic work?
Yeah, so I do keyboard and guitar, and so then most of the work I built it from those, and then also I did some of the electronic work on that, and then also I have a friend who's a pastor, and he used to play for the band Gunger, and he's
Oh
got a
wow.
lot of really popular musicians that he works with, and so he worked with me on getting like I have another album or some singles that came out that I'll probably put together into an EP, and he had like a professional drummer on those, and
Oh
he
wow.
did some electric guitar stuff like that. So yeah.
Yeah, the drum work was really clean in there. I basically have to depend on a drum machine or some variant thereof
Hmm.
for the work. But yeah, I enjoyed the clarity of the recording, so that was
Yeah,
pretty cool.
thanks.
Um, is politics a fair game for this conversation?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Where did you inherit or grow your current political views? Was that, I mean, in my case, it was kind of growing up in the conservative evangelical world. You assumed that you would be a Republican. And when I was in college, I had a professor who was a Democrat who was also a professing Christian, and it broke my mind. I could not, at the age of what would have that been, like 20, 19, something like that. Uh, I could not reconcile that in my head, how this guy could be talking about Jesus and call himself a Democrat. It just, I could not understand that. So it was, in my world at least, assumed that if you were a Christian, you were a Republican. What about you?
Yeah, so I grew up in a very Republican household. In the 1990s, we were very afraid about of Bill Clinton and the Democrats. We thought, especially with the rapture that was supposedly going to happen at Y2K, we were
Yeah.
convinced that Bill Clinton was going to declare himself president forever and hand the United States over to the United Nations. And then the tribulation would happen. So most of my life I was terrified of Democrats. And anytime a Democrat would die, I would picture them burning in hell, and finally getting the justice they deserved for being a Democrat. And I listen to Rush Limbaugh every day,
Yep.
Sean Hannity, Bill O'Reilly, Dennis Prager, and a lot of these guys. So I would have been like I was big into the Tea Party. I
Hmm.
totally would have been a Christian nationalist. And then in 2015, actually throughout this time around 2014 or so, my we had a relative come live with us who worked for me, and he was a Bernie Sanders supporter. And so that was interesting having a Bernie Sanders supporter living with me in that mindset during the Trump election.
Wow.
So we had a few, heated arguments,
Sure.
and it was frustrating for me because he was a younger guy, just graduated from college, and I wanted to influence him, but he just wasn't going to buy into the whole Trump thing. And so at the same time I'm going through the worship school, I'm growing in self-awareness. I'm starting to have questions. I'm healing. I'm opening up to my neighbor. I'm listening to people that I would have never listened to before, authors I would have never listened to before. And and so I experienced this theological change to the point where I started feeling very uncomfortable with the way Trump was treating women and the
Hmm.
way he was talking about people from other countries. So in 2016, I wanted him to win, but I couldn't vote for him,
Yeah.
and I voted third party. And and then around 2018, as that election was getting closer, the midterms, I remember thinking, like, my theology has changed, but my politics really hasn't. And like, does my politics mean more to me than my theology?
Yeah.
And that just seemed odd. And so then I started just really reflecting more on politics and how my positions um were valuing certain outcomes of justice that were based off of theologies that I no longer believed in. I
Hmm.
no longer believed in justice as retribution, so why do I believe in politics of retribution? I
Sure.
no longer believe in theologies of hierarchy, so why am I hoping for politics of hierarchy, of Christian nationalism and stuff? And so that's really when my politics began to change. 2018, I voted Democratic for the first time, um, and then it's gone on since there. So,
Yeah, I voted for Trump twice, but my real deconstruction happened in 2021, especially,
mhm.
watching January 6th really flipped the script for me. It just completely upended any sense that I had that I could follow that party anymore. What's your greatest concern right now for the nation?
I think it's I think a lot of it comes back to that lack of awareness again. Um, I think especially with the media talks about a lot of things that are kind of window dressing.
Mm.
Um, Trump's conversation with Musk didn't go well. Trump got shot. Trump's fading. Uh, Kamala Harris has big crowds, but Trump thinks they're AI, and so they're reporting a lot of these surface activities. But a lot of people have not really been aware of the dynamics and danger of things like Project 2025 and
Yeah.
these authoritarian Christians who are trying to get into public schools and present their theology that harms kids. And so I think that um, a big concern is that there's an undertow, like this movement
Mm.
of people being very explicit about the power they want, but there's just not the general awareness of it. And I think I've noticed it more recently. Like CNN just had an hour long thing on Saturday night about Christian nationalism, so I think they're starting to pick up on it more. And you're hearing more and more people talk about Project 2025 and stuff. But so I think it's been getting better. But that would be my big concern, is that we're going to lose too many freedoms without realizing what was going on.
I love your word undertow. Have you written about that, as a concept?
No, it just kind of came out. I haven't
No,
thought
it's a
about it too much.
fascinating word because it says a lot, I think. I don't know about your experience with undertow. I've experienced it in swimming before, and it's insidious because it's hidden.
Hmm.
If you know what you're looking for on the surface of the ocean, you can spot an area of undertow, but you can't see it when you're in the water. And
Hmm.
the next thing you know, you're getting swept out to sea without any ability to fix it unless you know the one escape path, which is go sideways to all the flow.
Yeah.
And there's a whole book there.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
I'm I'm, I'm going to think about that more. That word is fascinating. Undertow.
And what does it look like to go sideways?
Yeah, yeah, and that's where a lot of us who are deconstructing are finding ourselves right now. Is
Hmm.
I can't follow this, the thing that I grew up in. I can't follow that thing that I grew up in. It's almost useless to swim against the flow. Um, Showing a different way is so important these days. And to me, that's what I think we can do about it is demonstrate something different. Like, I've started on my social media pages to with that I know my family and friends frequent. Um, Instead of attacking what they're saying, I'm just sharing a different point of view in a positive way and hoping that that will open their eyes to the situation that they're getting swept in themselves. You know, like, oh, look, crime is way down. That's amazing. Which obviously
Hmm.
directly counters the Trump line of, oh, our nation's going to hell in a handbasket and the crime rates are skyrocketing and homicides are up. No, they're down 24% in this year. you know, something just to share a different way of thinking about things without being antagonistic or attacking. That's the sideways I think that I'm trying to do. I don't know. You have anything that
Yeah,
you've
that's interesting. Like, I've recently seen a thing on um, improv, which is,
okay?
these comedians who get up on stage and they don't know what they're gonna do, but they just start and they just go and they interact with each other. And one of the things they do is they say when somebody says something, you don't confront and go against them. You take more of like this and also approach, like, oh, and also look at this. Also, let's go over
Almost a
here.
jujitsu for
Yeah. I wonder if
pull
that
in the
might be
same
a
direction as them and take advantage of it.
yeah, and so then rather than your heads butting and getting lost in this big, face to face thing, you're kind of like just shifting the flow of the conversation a bit more. I wonder if maybe that might be a metaphor to consider here.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea because it's certainly more winsome, I guess. And I know some people hate that word, but I love it.
Hmm.
Just the idea of what can I do to draw you along in the direction that I think you need to go without fighting you. Um, you've obviously been thinking about these things and writing about them for a long time. You've been writing with Baptist News Global for quite a while. Um, they say you're a former Clemens Fellow. Can you describe what that is?
Yeah, so when I graduated from Northern Seminary in 2021, that was like first week of June or whatever. That summer, I ended up they Baptist News Global asked me to do a 10-week fellowship with them.
Okay.
So basically, that was when I started writing an article each week for them, and I was meeting with different writers throughout the week and learning about religion writing. And so that's basically what that was kind of a concentrated time of writing and also learning that they were providing for me.
So that's how you got started writing for them. Do you enjoy that? Is it like a passion thing for you, or is it a side gig?
Well, yeah, it's definitely a passion for me. Like I was writing when I was 4 or 5 years old, and I even have some copies of books that I wrote way back then and stuff. So like I've always been writing, and really in 2019 when um my I was really struggling financially in the cleaning industry at that point, and our vehicle broke down and my body was really struggling with a lot of the physical challenges and the stress, and I'd had shingles at age 35. And so basically, like, we realized my wife had a degree in interior design, and we're like, well, why don't we switch places and she can get an interior design job, make more money than I can in the janitorial business, and then I could focus on what I wanted to do, which was writing. And so basically, that's when we made the switch. Within a couple weeks, she had a job, and then I was staying home with my 5 kids, and then I just started blogging on my blog, and then that summer in 2020 I had written an article and posted it on Facebook, and Baptist News editor found it and really liked it, and they were like, "Hey, could we put this on our website?" And so I was like, "Sure." And so then after that, I pitched him another idea, and I wrote like, I don't remember, maybe a dozen articles that year or something. Um, Probably wasn't even that much. But then it just, and then I was still pretty busy with school for the next year, so I couldn't write a ton. But then after I graduated, I just been basically writing every week, basically. So
Yeah, and you have a hugely diverse topic base too. Um, it must be interesting to be on a schedule like that. I kind of write when something moves me, but it turns out to be about once every week or week and a half. But um, there's got to be a difference in pressure when you know you have a this needs to be done kind of deadline.
yeah, and I'm freelance, so it's not like I'm gonna get fired if I don't. But it's just it's I like routine, and it's been helpful to really be part of that and help me focus. And and it's a lot of fun. It's what I like doing, and so I don't have a plan for the next like 10 weeks of what I have to write about. It's more, it's kind of, it started off that way, like, oh, I've got these passions I want to say things about, but then it became more like recognizing what's going on in the world this week and what conversations are happening, and then speaking into those conversations. And so that's why a lot of the some of the topics can be similar, but some of them, there can be a lot of diversity too.
Do you get feedback about how those come across? I mean, I know with my blog, I can sort of track how many people view things. And, with the podcast, I basically record all my blogs as a podcast and a video these days. And so I know roughly how many people watch or listen to it, but I have no idea. I'm kind of curious if you get any kind of this worked, this didn't kind of feedback on those writings.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it depends on um, social media. I get a lot of feedback there. I'll get some messages to my website. Um, and I mean, there's always people that are angry about things that I write.
Of
Um,
course.
and so sometimes there'll be like a response podcast that somebody comes out with, or a video. Um, and a lot of times those are like, they don't even have anything to do with what I wrote. Like, this
Yeah.
guy made a whole YouTube video. It's got like 40,000 views of him making fun of me for being a stay-at-home dad and talking about me being in the
Yeah.
bathtub sipping wine. And I'm like, what does this have to do with anything? Like, he's just revealing what he thinks about women and stay-at-home moms, you know. So,
Yeah. 40,000 views of anything I did would be a miracle, but usually I'm a few hundred at most.
yeah.
Uh, One of the interesting things to me about Baptist news is that I very rarely see any significant view counts on their or like counts on their um, stuff that they post on Twitter. So I wonder where they get their views from. I
Yeah,
guess they have subscribers.
they you can subscribe to weekly newsletters where they'll send out articles, and like my traffic, like, um I don't know like a ton about uh how they're comparing to other platforms, but I know that my traffic on my articles are really significant, even if there's not a ton of likes on Twitter, for example.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's really, it's hard for me to like, if it gets a lot of shares online, I know it's probably a sign that it's getting a lot of reads. But oftentimes it will feel like there's not much online, but then it'll get more reads, or I'll feel like there's more shares that I'm seeing online, but it'll have less reads. And so that's kind of, the algorithm thing's kind of weird for me to figure out.
One of the interesting things for me is that one of the things that I went through as I was in the counseling uh, just prior to starting to deconstruct was God kind of yanking my chain about being focused on approval and attention seeking
Hmm.
from other people. And so there's an interesting tension for me on social media and blogging and podcasting of, am I doing this because I want the popularity and I want more views, or am I doing it because God has put something on my heart that needs sharing, or is there a balance in there between them? And trying to avoid getting caught in that trap of popularizing myself just to get more views.
Hmm.
Um, it almost becomes an interesting exercise in how I'm thinking about the world more than anything else. So,
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because growing up in conservative evangelicalism, like in fundamentalism, everything was through the grid of making sure God got the glory for everything. And like, so there was, going into any kind of public creation work, like, you have this fear that maybe, like, I don't want to take attention away from God
yeah.
in what I do. So I can't, like, it almost affects the quality of what you create. And
Hmm.
so that can be kind of difficult to process sometimes, when you're like hanging on to some of that stuff. But I feel like where I've kind of come to in moving out of this hierarchical way of relating to God. It's more of like, it's not, do I love my neighbor m- more than Jesus, or have I placed my neighbor at a higher place than Jesus? But it's like, you show you love Jesus by the way you love your neighbor. When you give a drink of water to your neighbor, you're giving. He said, "You do it for me. When you do it for the least of these, you do it for me." And so that's kind of where I've moved more toward, is valuing spreading awareness and as an opportunity to love, for people to love their neighbors as themselves. And and so I'm not, your ego can still get trapped in that. Um, but then and there's some, that can be a spiritual journey that you need to take too, as far as like reflecting on, um am I in a healthy place in doing this out of love, or out of like trying to just build myself up. I'm not that concerned about a hierarchy of glory so much, but there is like a, there can be an internal lack of health.
Yeah. One of the favorite songs that of mine that I wrote was called "Transparently," and the chorus basically says, when the world is watching me, let your love be all they see. May I fade that you increase. Let me live transparently. And that's kind of been my one of my overriding themes, trying to do that. Stay out of the limelight. Let me be transparent. Let me present something, but let God be seen through it, not me being focused. So,
And one way that you can do with that, especially like I'll try to do with my writing, is I don't want to be the hero of every article.
mhm.
um like, here are my thoughts about this and why you're wrong. Like, it's more like I'll bring voices to the article through quotes that maybe aren't being heard, and I often end an article with a quote by someone else, so someone else is having the last word. And so that's a way of cultivating a conversation, and really doing it well, but bringing other voices to the table rather than your own pontifications.
That makes sense. I like that approach. And that kind of leads me to this other question I wanted to ask you, which is that a lot of your writing, just what you said about bringing other voices, a lot of your writing seems focused on uncovering data that is often hidden from plain view. You like to talk about the history of things, the history of the church, evangelicalism, conservative politics, politicians. Um, that's, I think, particularly useful in the season when one of my personal concerns is that most Christians, particularly, and a lot of conservative people in a politics scale, don't know their history really at all. And there's a ton of stuff that we've always assumed has been always the way that things have been. And when you actually know the history, you realize, no, this is a very new way of looking at the world, or that thing happened because of this. Uh, so you seem to do that particularly, almost, I would say, every single article that I've read. What drives that interest for you? Why are you bent that way, do you think?
Yeah, so like in conversations about religion and politics, or that I tend to focus on, like, people are really wanting to define reality. They're
Hmm.
wanting to know what's true. And so a big thing for me is I think of it in terms of like, okay, what is reality? Um and just like, for example, looking at the universe, like, what kind of planet are we dealing with? Are we dealing with a flat earth? Are we dealing with a globe? Um like, and then research tools for me is are like portals that you can use
Okay.
to travel anywhere you want to go. So once you learn where the continents are, you can begin to travel to those continents more freely and quickly. Then within each continent, where are the countries? Okay, now we can get a little bit more specific. Where are the cities? We can get even more precise. What's in between the cities? And then you're like, oh, wait a minute, there's actually oceans here too. And so I kind of think spatially like this. And so you can begin to notice how this map is revealed by the language people use, and the relationships that they're setting up. And so, for example, in conservative evangelicalism, you've got John MacArthur, who's very popular, and he talks about how the whole universe is a basis is based on authority, relationships of authority and submission. And he
Right.
talks about pastors being the highest power that one can ascend to. So he's not defining a globe here. He's defining a flat vertical plane of power dynamics. And and so that's what we're dealing with. And so then, the continents within that cosmology, so to speak, is like the gospel story. Um, is this a law and punishment thing? Because that's based off of authority and submission. Creation, fall, redemption, restoration is another way of talking about it. Um, and then you can get into like, okay, well, more particularly, what about like countries? He'll talk about the created order, and and then in Catholicism, J.D. Vance will talk about order. He was drawn to conservative Catholicism because of order. Or Al Mohler will talk about ordered liberty when he's discussing whether or not homosexuality should be banned in America. And and so you begin to see a lot of that common language that they're using there. And then like the example of a city could be like worship is basically submitting to the highest power by taking your place in the hierarchy. And so that's where they get into things like biblical manhood and womanhood, or gender roles, or scripts about what men and women are like, how to punish your kids. And so, really, when I look at this as a whole, I'm looking at like the root to the fruit conversation, and
Hmm.
I'm wanting to cover all these contexts. Um, I'm wanting to cover it at the city level, the country level, the continent level, and the big picture, what kind of planet are we dealing with level. And and to like kind of give an example of that, like JD Vance wants to advance a voting policy where families get more votes. He wants to do that to punish companies that don't submit to his culture war.
Right.
That's like the city. Why does he do that? Because he's drawn to order. Well, why is he drawn to order? Because he believes that justice is retributive based off of this authority and submission paradigm. So you can kind of see how there's all these different contexts, these roots and branches that are informing the fruit of his particular conversation. Al Mohler wants to criminalize homosexuality because he believes in ordered liberty, because he believes in this law and punishment paradigm that's based off an authority and submission cosmology of reality.
It says
And
something
so,
about his God.
yeah, 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 and that defines what your God is like too. Yeah, and so that's a lot of what I'm doing is I'll look at a specific situation, and then I want to try to map it onto these different like what's informing the fruit, and there are different ways that happens.
Yeah, your use of the word cosmology is helpful there. That makes a lot of
Yeah,
sense. Well, I have a few minutes left. I did want to ask you about the book that you're working on, Worship Warfare. It looks like that's coming out, about a little over a year now.
it'll be in 2026. I don't know obviously when it's coming out yet, but yeah. So I'm in the middle of writing it right now.
So, based on our conversation, I'm going to guess that it would not be a very Sean Foyt friendly book. And when
No.
he says the word worship warfare, I think he probably means something different than you. What's the subtitle?
It's how the songs of white evangelicalism have hold on, how the songs of white evangelicalism shaped the have become the soundtrack of the right. I might
Okay.
be misquoting it. Some of that's still up in the air, but that's kind of the general theme.
Yeah.
Is
Okay.
these songs about like praises the water my enemies drown in. Sean Foyt has one about the Liberty Bells, and so it's this theme of Christian liberty, but it's being talked about in this Americanized theme of the Liberty Bell. And so a lot of it ends up being it goes back to this warfare. Those who won't come into our tower and submit to our power dynamics, there's a wall between us, and we're fighting them in a war. And so we're going to sing about that, and we're going to pursue that in our politics, which always turns out meaning voting for Republicans.
Have you read the book Centered Set Christianity or Centered Set
N-
Church?
no, I haven't.
I think that's the title, something like that. The idea between bounded set and centered set is fascinating, worth your time. But the basic idea would be like, uh, if I asked you, is Yul Brynner bald? You'd probably say, well, yeah. Or Dwayne the Rock Johnson. You'd say,
Hmm.
absolutely, they're bald, right? If I pointed you to someone like Bernie Sanders and said, is he bald? You'd probably say, well, not really. I mean, he's got thinning hair.
Hmm.
What defines the line between bald and not bald? It's kind of fuzzy, right? There's no
Yeah.
specific wall between those two things. But if I held up an apple and an orange and said, which is the apple, there would be absolutely no question in your mind which was the apple and which was the orange. And that's an example of a bounded set. There's a very clearly defined set of things that is an apple. There's not a very clearly defined set of things that is bald, but you can point to the prime example and say, well, that's the example. And
Hmm.
so when you start thinking about religion and you realize, well, if we focus on being more like Jesus, then I can allow for an awful lot of variation between the people around me, and we're still pointing to Jesus and trying to be more like Jesus and not need necessarily to build these strict walls. But a bounded set church will basically say, no, 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 no. You have to have exactly definitions of what it means to be Christian. You've got to use this creed and you've got to say these set of beliefs. And oh, by the way, oh, now you're raising the question of homosexuality. Nope, that's out. That's another bit of the wall. And pretty soon you end up with this mile high wall around your church, which people have to submit themselves to be part of the in crowd. And it's a tribalism sense. And, I see that kind of thing happening in what you were just talking about. You're talking about a more um, centered set world where we're pointing to an example of the way to be, but we can work with other people. Whereas someone like Sean Foyt is very much a bounded set kind of a thinker of we have to know exactly what's in or out. Al Mohler, all these other people that you mentioned, very very
Yeah.
bounded set thinking.
Yeah, and a lot of that comes down to like it can come down to the what you think about the Great Commission. Um,
True.
is the Great Commission about getting people to agree with your theology and come into your tower and submit to your power dynamics? Or if you consider the Great Commission within the context of Jesus' teaching of love your neighbors yourself, then is it really a a way of spreading love of neighbors itself
Yeah.
in the world? Well, then that's going to completely change your posture toward your neighbor,
Sure.
who may be different from you and may have some different perspectives than you.
Yeah, and ultimately I think that's the only way that we ever reach that idea of Jesus talking in John 17 about Father make them one, where
Hmm.
if we're going to work and live with people that are different than us, how do we have to be in the world to accept that and to let that be uh, fruitful? Is we've got to be willing to walk alongside other people that don't think the way we do without calling them demonic, you know?
Yeah, and that's where like there was a conversation between a New Apostolic Reformation independent charismatic guy named Lance Wallnau
Oh, yeah.
and Donald, and he posted on his Facebook about this conversation he had with Donald Trump, and he said that Trump told him that they were talking about basically that Christians are the most powerful voting bloc in America, but they have no punch. This was in 2015 because they're not unified, and how they were talking about how they need to find a way to get Christians to come together. And if you look at a lot of these things that are happening then after that, that Lance Wallnau and Sean Foyt and these people are promoting these gatherings. There, there's one called the Courage Tour right now. They start with worship, and worship is bringing these people together who are across denominational lines, across racial lines, and they're singing about defeating their enemies. They're
Fighting.
singing songs about fighting,
Hmm.
and then this somebody will get up and give a basically a sermon that is basically about politics, and then they do a call to action, an altar call, which is you know sign up for sign up for our app, sign up to work the elections, sign up to do this to elect Donald Trump in 2024. And so a lot of these events that are happening, even the January 6th insurrection, there were microphones set up and people were singing worship music. as the
Mm.
soundtrack to what was going on. And so like if you're singing and you're celebrating with this like stadium rock feel that's just it's affecting your body and it's making you feel really good about yourself and what you're singing, but the things you're singing about is your enemies drowning, and you're naming those enemies as your neighbors that are politically different from you, that's going to shape your relationships over time. And that's what I'm trying to do in the book is,
Not in a good way.
yeah, is show how worship is has been utilized to whip people up into this um you know attacking posture toward their neighbors.
That's good stuff. I really look forward to reading that when it comes out. And I'm hoping as you get closer, we can have another conversation because I'd love to talk more about that topic because it's increasingly on my heart as I've watched, even someone that I've loved for decades, like Michael W. Smith and Fight My Battles kind of songs. And I'm
Hmm.
realizing there's things there that are toxic. And it's, yeah, once your eyes are open to it, it's hard not to see. So I'm don't have time for it today, but I'd love to explore that with you in the future because I
Yeah,
think that would be
definitely.
a fascinating conversation. And you've obviously been thinking about it for a while. So, well, I appreciate your time today. I really enjoyed it and covered a lot of very varied ground today. And I'm sure we could keep going, but I want to honor your time and thank you very much.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me.
All right, we'll talk soon. Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. We found a lot of commonality in our personal histories as well as our current doctrinal and political understandings, and I certainly hope to talk to Rick again sometime soon. If you have a chance, I'd appreciate your feedback and comments, and please drop a like on whatever platform you listen or view this interview. It does help others to find my channel. So be blessed, and we'll talk again soon.